My name is Jody Schweitzer, Water Program Director with the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. So thank you all for joining us today. For the folks in the room in person, we also have a little more than 30 people on Zoom too. So a couple of housekeeping things to start off. If you have questions as we go, please ask questions. This is a refresher training, so we're going to go kind of quickly through some of this content, but we're recording this, so it'll be available as a recording afterwards, and I can also provide a copy of all of the slides. So lots of references to look back to. And there are also a couple of handouts that everybody should have gotten. A copy of the full workbook. So this is the workbook that goes with the 6-hour training. So we're going to kind of skip around through different sections of this workbook, but it's a really great resource as you go through developing your INMP and your INMR, or if you don't know what those acronyms mean, this book will define all of that for you. You should also have a copy of the INMP worksheet and the INMR worksheet. So those are likely stapled together, might be separate. Those should all be slipped inside. I think we also handed out a copy of the Ag Order Summary of Requirements. So this is just kind of a helpful handout of all of the things that changed when the Ag Order was adopted last September, the INMP and INMR requirements being one of those changes. Everybody online should have received an email this morning with links to those resources. So if you can have the INMP and INMR worksheets handy, that'll be really helpful as we go through. What other housekeeping things did I have? If you have questions online, we have a Q&A box, so please use that. We'll answer your questions as we go. If it's something that's helpful for the whole class, we can read those aloud, answer them verbally. And last thing I want to mention is big thank you to United Water Conservation District for hosting us here today, for helping us with the online IT support. Incredibly thankful for their partnership. So with that, go ahead and get started. I'm going to give a really brief background on some of the requirements and what the drivers are for these requirements. And then I'm going to dive into the INMP worksheet itself. So I'm going to talk through how to fill out that first page, how to develop your management unit, how to identify your crop cycle to include for reporting. Then Andre Biscaro with UC Cooperative Extension is going to go through irrigation and nutrient management practices and how those practices are accounted for on the worksheet. And then Ben Waddell with Fruit Growers Laboratory is going to wrap us up talking about the calculations behind your A value and your R value for nitrogen, and a couple of example calculations as well. Just wanted to highlight here how things have changed and how the program has grown and evolved over time. So the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program adopted in 2005. It's gone through 4 different iterations since that time. So we had the first conditional waiver, which is kind of just setting up the program. Second conditional waiver in 2010, which added TMDL requirements, total maximum daily load. And then in 2016, the third conditional waiver was adopted. And with that came a lot of changes. So one of those changes was the nitrogen management plan requirements. And those at that time only applied in areas where we had nitrogen impacts to surface water or groundwater. So in areas where we were getting exceedances for nitrogen, those growers had to develop their NMP, their nitrogen management plan. Nothing was reported. It was just kept on farm. But that was the requirement that is kind of being built on now. So now we have the INMP requirements, the irrigation and nutrient management plan requirements. And I'll talk about how those are different and what new things come with that. So the precedential requirements was what was incorporated into the Ag Order that requires these INMPs and INMRs. So what are the precedential requirements? First, they are a statewide regulation. So in 2018, the State Water Resource Control Board promulgated the East San Joaquin WDR, which is the waste discharge requirements for the East San Joaquin subwatershed. And in that regulatory order, the state board said, all of these requirements need to be precedential for every regional board throughout the state of California within the next 5 years. So 5 years from that was 2023, and that's when it was incorporated into our new Ag Order. These requirements are rolling out in every region of the state. So if you have growing operations in the Central Valley, they should probably be really familiar to you because this was the first area that they took effect. Central Coast as well, and then other areas of the state as well. They're rolling out as soon as those regional boards adopt their next regulatory orders. The requirements focus on addressing nitrogen in surface and groundwater through comprehensive irrigation and nutrient management program. So this includes groundwater quality trend monitoring, irrigation and nutrient management plan development, irrigation and nutrient management report submittal, on-farm drinking well sampling. So if you have an on-farm well that's used for drinking water, you probably received a letter from the Regional Water Quality Control Board 2 months or so ago, directing you to sample your well. And then the development of groundwater protective formulas, values, and targets. So how are we going to ensure that surface water and groundwater are protected and not contaminated with nitrogen based on some of the data that we're collecting through this reporting? What we're going to focus on today is the INMP and the INMR submittal components of this. So the driver behind these requirements is nitrogen contamination. And that includes both nitrate in surface water as well as groundwater. So a quick snapshot of what surface water conditions look like here locally in Ventura County. This map outlines the, okay, I guess I get this one. The 3 main watersheds. We've got the Ventura River watershed, the Santa Clara River watershed, and the Cayugas Creek watershed. Each of those watersheds have a nitrogen TMDL that has been developed for that watershed. So what that means is that there was an impairment for something related to nitrogen or nutrients that drove the need for a TMDL regulation to be adopted. So for the Ventura River, we have the Ventura River LG TMDL, which has a compliance date of June 2019. For the Santa Clara River, we have the nitrogen TMDL with a compliance date of 2004. And for the Cayugas Creek watershed, again, the nitrogen TMDL with a compliance date of 2010. So those are the dates by which the nitrogen water quality benchmarks need to be met. And if you have any questions about TMDLs, we did a whole TMDL workshop a couple months ago. We have a recording for that, so I'm happy to share that with anybody as well. But this just kind of shows that we do have some nitrate surface water impacts in Ventura County, which is a driver for these requirements. Nitrate in groundwater looks actually better. So while other parts of the state have their groundwater more heavily impacted by nitrate, groundwater in Ventura County, for the most part, looks pretty good. So VCALG has been putting together these nitrate trends tracking reports for the last couple of years. This is one of the more recent ones. So you can see each icon represents a location of a well that we are tracking the trend of nitrate in. If it's blue, that means it's either completely non-detect, so we're not able to detect any nitrogen, or up to 2 parts per million or 2 milligrams per liter of nitrate. If it's green, that's between 2 and 5 parts per million, and the threshold is 10. 10 is what we want to stay below. If it's yellow, it's 5 to 10, and then orange is 10 to 25. So there's only a couple of orange wells here on this map. Red would be anything above 25 parts per million or milligrams per liter. And as you can see, we don't have any of those. So for the most part, with very few exceptions, groundwater in Ventura County is looking pretty good. And I had mentioned a couple of concentrations of nitrate. So I just wanted to clarify how we are measuring and then reporting nitrate. So when the lab analyzes for nitrogen or nitrate, there's 2 ways that it can report it. It can report it as nitrate, which includes the entire ion of nitrate. So your 3 oxygen atoms and your 1 nitrogen atom, or it can report it as nitrate dash nitrogen or nitrate dash N, which is only looking at the nitrogen atom there. And that's important because the standard against which we are comparing is going to depend on how that's reported. So if it's reported as nitrate dash N or nitrate dash nitrogen, then we're looking at 10. 10 parts per million or milligrams per liter is the standard for drinking water. And that's also the standard that more commonly applies to surface water as well. We have some areas, some parts of different watersheds where that standard might be lower. It's never going to be above that though. It's always 10 or something lower. And if you're looking at nitrate, so the entire nitrate ion there, then you'd be looking at 45 would be the number that you would compare against. So when you get any lab results or see it reported, you want to look at, is this nitrate-N or nitrate? And then this is an interactive map that you can go to at this QR code or this link. And you can look in what water quality constituent you're looking for and see what the groundwater conditions in your local area are showing. So if you go to this link, you can put in nitrate or nitrogen and identify the wells you want to look at and see what the conditions look like in your area. And as you can see, our area right here, we don't have that many red icons. So as I said, groundwater in our area is looking pretty good. We don't have the same issues as the Central Coast or Central Valley. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, good question. So the question was, does that have any bearing on the aggressiveness of the reporting or really what your requirements are? You can be held to the same standard as a grower in an area that's more heavily impacted. And because these were promulgated by the state board as saying these requirements are going to apply everywhere, then no, they're going to apply everywhere. The perspective of our regional board is when water quality looks really good, they want to make sure that it stays that way. So they are very reluctant to back off any requirements when water quality is looking improved. There are certain things that growers in the Central Valley have to do above and beyond this. So there's, drinking water delivery programs that they pay into. So there's a more significant cost that they're paying to, I guess, mitigate some of those impacts on top of some of this reporting. So in that sense, it is a little bit different. Okay, so how have these requirements changed? Everybody who's here likely attended this training when we were focused on the NMP requirements. So this is, whoops. Sorry. I'm trying to get this to go back to the, did I hold it? There's a way to get it to go back to the laser pointer. I can't figure it out. So this is the worksheet that we used to have for the NMP. So this is a one-pager. It accounted for a pre-season planning component and a post-season planning component. There's a lot of common elements that will be carried over into the INMP worksheet. So same fundamental process for calculating the nitrogen needs and accounting for nitrogen sources, the same certification requirements, but there are also some differences. So one of the big differences is that it applies to all growers. So no longer is it something that only applies to the watersheds where we have exceedances for nitrogen. It just applies everywhere. So if you are a grower in Ventura County, these requirements apply to you. There are additional irrigation industry management questions that are added onto the form. There is an exemption to certify your plan. You still have to do the plan, but there's an exemption to certify it if you're less than 10 acres, and I'll talk about that again in a second. But the biggest change is that now there is a reporting aspect of this. So no longer is it just a plan that you put together and you keep on your farm. Summary information will have to be reported. So the INMP, which is the plan component, it is an active planning document. It's developed every year. It's kept on farm. So the INMP itself isn't turned into anybody. There's one INMP that would need to be developed for each management unit. We're going to talk a lot more about what a management unit means. So fundamentally, though, it's just same crop, same age, same management practices, and contiguous land. There's a pre-season component to it where you have your column A. So this is kind of before you plant your season or at the beginning of your calendar year for perennial crops. It's your pre-season plan, and that's the part that you're certifying. You're certifying kind of the plan part of it. And then there's a post-season true up. So at the end of your year or at the end of your harvest cycle, what actually happened? How much irrigation water did you actually apply or fertilizer did you actually apply? And what were your harvest yields? And then the certification requirements. So as I mentioned, those are the same as they were under the NMP. So they can be self-certified by a qualified grower. So somebody who's done the full training class and taken that 30-question multiple choice test afterwards. So if you pass that test, then you are qualified to certify your own plan. Or you can work with NRCS, their technical service providers, or you can work with a certified crop advisor. So if there's already a certified crop advisor that you work with, those folks can sign your plan. And then the initial plans are due March 1st of next year, and then every year thereafter. And then there's the INMR. And we're going to go through these worksheets in more detail too. This is just kind of your quick glimpse summary of it all. So the INMR is the report, and this is due initially March 1st of 2026. So not this coming March, but the following one. And then it pulls over some summary information from that INMP. So it's going to pull over the irrigation nutrient management practice questions. It's going to pull over the total nitrogen applied per management unit, as well as the harvest yield at the end of your season. The report gets submitted to VCALG, and it'll be through our Clearwater portal. The data gets anonymized. So this is a really important point that has been heavily litigated in the Central Valley, where these requirements rolled out years ago, and growers are very insistent that this is proprietary information and that it needs to be anonymized before it is publicly reported. So when you report the total pounds of nitrogen that you apply per management unit, and we include that as VCALG in our reports to the regional board, that's going to be anonymized per just a generic ID number. And then the data from that will be used to inform the development of groundwater protective formulas, values, and targets. So we have requirements over the coming years to develop those. First one will be those protective formulas, then the values, then the targets, as well as identify outliers. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that outlier process looks like and then what it means to be an outlier. So the INMP worksheet certification. If you're here, you likely are taking the self-certification route. So again, that means you completed the training program and you took the exam. So this is just the refresher class. You had to have taken the full class before. And then to maintain that certification, you have to participate in continuing education. So this right here is your 2 hours of continuing education for that requirement. The standard is 3 hours every 3 years, and the content has to focus on irrigation and nitrogen management. I don't want to get things too confusing with a CEU program because for VCALG, it's 2 hours every year, but you can combine those. So as long as the program or the workshop advertises, 2 hours of VCALG CEUs and 2 hours of INMP self-certification CEUs, which we'll list as a separate item, then you'd get credit for both. So kind of just keeping in mind, I need 2 hours per year of VCALG CEUs, and making sure that at least every other year, one of them is an INMP self-certification CEU course, then you'll be killing 2 birds with one stone. All INMPs must be certified. So you either do it yourself if you are qualified, or NRCS, or a CCA. The one exemption for this is if you have a total farming operation that is less than 10 acres. So altogether less than 10 acres, then you don't have to certify your plan. You still have to do the plan, you still have to report on it, do everything else. It just doesn't actually have to be certified. And I guess the other qualifier I wanted to add here is that you also can't be identified as an outlier. So if you were less than 10 acres, but you were identified as an outlier any given year, then you would have to certify any plans going forward from that. So this is really just intended for, backyard orchard operators to give them a little bit of regulatory relief to not have to certify the plan. And then if that does apply to you, then you would note that on the INMP and the INMR. There is a little box here. Does the member's total farming operation consist of less than or equal to 10 acres? Deadlines. So the INMP deadline, as I mentioned, March 1st of 2025, so this coming March, and then every year after that. If you're a perennial crop grower, you would develop your INMP for that calendar year. So by March 1st of next year, you need to have a plan that covers all of 2025. If you're an annual crop grower, you would develop your INMP for all crops that will be planted in 2025. For the report part of it, again, it's a little bit more straightforward for perennial crops. So you will report on the prior calendar year. So for the first report coming up in March 1st of 2026, you're going to report on everything that happened in 2025, just calendar year. If you're an annual crop grower, a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to talk through a couple of situations. But you're going to report on all crops that were harvested the prior calendar year, even if they weren't necessarily established during that year, with the exception of the first year. So this one can get a little complicated, but I'll talk through it again a little bit here. But really it's, because cropping seasons don't align with regulatory calendars, there will be some times where you might have established your crop before these INMP requirements took effect. Maybe you established a crop in 2024, you didn't harvest it until 2025. So that would not need to be accounted for on an INMP or reported on an INMR. It's really only this first reporting year that'll have some nuance to it. Every year going forward, you'll just have to remember, for my reporting year, I'm reporting on everything that was harvested the year before. So this hopefully kind of is a little flow chart that will help keep that a little bit straight. So for the March 1st of 2026 INMR submittal, if you're a perennial crop grower, you just submit for the 2025 calendar year. If you're an annual crop grower, then you would first ask the question of, was there a completed crop cycle within 2025? So was it established in 2025 and also harvested in 2025? If yes, then you would submit your report for that crop cycle in by March 1st of 2026. If no, then you would still submit a report on March 1st of 2026, but that report would say no completed crop cycle within 2025, and you would be done for that year. And then you would hold your reporting for the next year. Go ahead. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So anything that's established in 2024, you don't have to report on it. So for but you're talking about a future year. Yep, exactly. Yep. So you wouldn't report to the following March. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a strawberry example coming up here. I'll show in a calendar that might help. So start again with the easy one. If you're a perennial crop grower, again, we're looking at calendar year. So your 2025 calendar year here in blue, you're going to develop your INMP for that year. And then March 1st of 2026, you'll report on everything in blue, and then you'll develop your next INMP for the time period covered in green. And then for the next year, you'll be submitting your INMR for everything in green, and you'll developing your INMP for everything in yellow. So here's a strawberry example. You figure this clicker out. Oh, there we go. Okay. So you have your 2024 planting. You planted it October of 2024. You're harvesting it, May and June of 2025. But you established that before the INMP requirements even took effect. So you aren't expected to have been tracking for that crop cycle. You don't have to do anything for the crop that you planted in blue. But for March 1st of 2025, you'll be developing your plan for your next planting. So your next planting here in green. And then come March 1st of 2026, you didn't have a completed crop cycle that was planted and harvested in 2025. You had one that was planted in 2025, but it's not done yet. So you will submit a report that says no crop cycle completed in 2025. And then you'll be done for that reporting. You'll develop your INMP for your 2026 planting. And then in March 1st of 2027, you're going to be reporting on your 2025 planting. So you're planting in green, because that'll be what you harvested the year prior. And then you'll be developing your INMP for a next planting in October of 2027. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cilantro, shorter term crop that doesn't span calendar years, a little bit more straightforward for this kind of a thing. So March 1st of 2025, you'll be developing your INMP for an April cilantro planting. And then March 1st of 2026, you're going to be submitting your report for your 2025 planting in blue here. And then you'll be developing your plan for a future planting in green. And then so on and so on. Mm-hmm. Question. So the March 1st requirement to develop your INMP for that upcoming year, like you said, a lot of times you don't know what you're going to be planting. Those are going to change depending on the market and conditions. So you develop your INMP for anything that you know that you're going to do or anything that you have in the ground. So by the time that you have that in the ground, you need to have an INMP for it. And that's why these are, living kind of dynamic documents or plans. Yeah, and the clarification on filing. So you're just keeping them on hand for yourself. And one thing that I also wanted to mention is while the plan itself is this kind of, rigid form, it can be much more dynamic. It really is about maintaining the information that this form identifies. So if you are a rotational vegetable grower, these are going to get really complicated really fast and add to a lot of paperwork. So this could easily translate into an Excel spreadsheet or some kind of a tracking document where you're just tracking, for each row, here's my planting, here's all the information I have to maintain for that. And you can, duplicate things too. Exactly. Yeah. It just needs to include this information. So if you have whatever tracking spreadsheet or tool that works well for you, as long as it's maintaining the information on this form, that's great. So if the regional board were to ever say, I want to see your INMP for the crops you have in the ground, you can just pull that up and that's fine. And that will also be maintaining all the information that you're going to need to then do your reporting. And we'll help growers in developing some of those tools too. So over the coming months, we'll be working in work groups and putting together ideas and resources to try to help with this. So we can put together some templates of what a spreadsheet would look like to track this in an easier way. I'm sure there are probably a lot of, nutrient management companies and CCAs have a lot of the stuff that they're putting together already. In Clearwater, we'll have a portal for doing your reporting. So as you finish a crop cycle, you can throw those reports in as you go. You don't have to wait until March 1st. But we'll be developing that module in Clearwater over the coming year. Should be done by later next year. So we'll have a lot of trainings in what those tools look like. Yeah. Crop name and age. So you'll see on the INMP worksheet that you have crop type and then crop age. Those need to come off of a standard list. The reason being that your crop type is going to correspond to a nitrogen removal coefficient. So the list is available here through that QR code or on VCALG's website. It's still in draft format right now because we submit it to the regional board and they have to approve that. But here's an example of what that list includes. So it's going to list all of the crops and it's going to list the pending nitrogen removal coefficient for that crop. So when you do your INMP and you list the crop type, it needs to be a crop type that is included on this list. And this is just a snapshot from that list. It's much longer than this. If you have a crop that's not accounted for on that list, you can reach out to me and let me know, but we'll probably build in an other category or something along those lines for the really specialty type crops in our Clearwater INMR reporting portal. And then crop age is only required for perennial crops. So if you were an orchard grower, you would need to include the age of your orchard. And that's going to be the age during the year that your INMP covers. And that is just because when we look at our all of the data compiled together, we'll likely be grouping orchards by age because the yield and the nutrient demand for trees is going to be variable depending on that age. So management units. So a management unit, and that is what your INMP is developed for. So you have one INMP for each management unit. And a management unit is defined as same crop, same age, same management practices. So you are irrigating it the same way, you are fertilizing it the same way, and then also contiguous land. So if you had two completely separate orchard operations, even if these three first qualifications applied, but they were non-contiguous, then those would have to be separate INMPs. So I'll go through a couple of examples. Example one, we have a 85-acre lemon orchard. It covers 4 different parcels, but they are contiguous parcels. The trees are the same age or very close to the same age. There's always, a little bit of room for kind of averaging here. And same nutrient and water inputs. This would be one management unit. One management unit that's covering these 4 parcels of lemons. Example number 2, we have a 50-acre field. We have rotation of strawberry and celery. And each rotation receives its own nutrient and water inputs. This would be 2 management units. So you would have one management unit for your strawberry, one management unit for your celery. Even though they are covering the same land, it is 2 different cropping seasons. And it wouldn't matter how many parcels this spans. So one thing that I didn't really detail here, but this is an example of one parcel outlined in yellow. And as you can see, there's clearly at least 3 different crops planted on this parcel. So we have one parcel, but at least 3 different management units within this parcel. And there might even be more. So maybe, we've got strawberry here, there might be another cropping season in there. So you have at least 3 management units here, possibly more if you have any rotations, even though you have one parcel. You can also have the opposite, where you can have one management unit that spans multiple parcels in this situation right here. Third example here, 30-acre vegetable field. We've got rotations of cilantro, peppers, and cabbage. Each rotation receives the same nutrient and water inputs. This would be 3 different management units. We've got a management unit for our cilantro, for our peppers, and our cabbage. Last example here, things get a little bit more complicated with nurseries. So we have a 25-acre nursery. It covers 2 contiguous parcels, and there's a mix of drip and hand watering. I would call this one management unit, even though we might have 2 different irrigation methods, but because they are not different enough to really necessitate 2 different plans, then I think this would be one management unit. And there's going to be some situations like this where we'll just kind of have to evaluate and apply our best judgment. And it's really just about, doing what makes the most sense and also what's defensible. So parcel management, on the first portion of the INMP, you can see that there's a column here for APN. So your assessor parcel number. If you have a management unit that spans multiple parcels, you're going to list all of the parcels that it covers. You can add, whatever kind of your friendly name for that ranch or block is, and then the number of irrigated acres that are within that management unit. So, and it's only the amount of irrigated acres within that management unit, not necessarily within that parcel. So maybe this situation for this portion or this parcel, maybe this management unit only covers half of it, and that's 22 acres. There might be another portion of that same parcel that's included in a different management unit. So you're just going to include the parcels, the friendly name, and the irrigated acreage within that management unit within the parcel. One thing that's going to make this a little bit easier in Clearwater, we'll have a mapping function where you can trace out the delineation of your management unit, and that will help you calculate the parcels and the irrigated acres that are included within that management unit. And then, as I said, you can have multiple APNs, you could have one APN, you could have a portion of an APN. Okay, INMR submittal. So your INMR is the report portion of this. It's going to be submitted in Clearwater, which hopefully everybody has accessed. You should have, your login credentials. You would have done your farm evaluation survey through Clearwater, view your invoice through Clearwater, make any parcel changes or grower, billing party, membership changes you have. Clearwater is kind of the one-stop location for everything related to VCALG and the compliance requirements under the ag order. So this will also be an additional kind of tab or module that will be added in. As I mentioned before, later next year is when it should be finalized, but we're developing it now, working with consultants who have worked with coalitions in the Central Valley. So they have a lot of experience working with growers and creating something that is intuitive and also kind of accounts for some of the nuance in management unit development and reporting. So we'll do some beta testing and grower workshops probably next summer as well as we develop those to make it as useful and functional of a tool as possible for everybody. We'll also have office hours and call support for anybody who needs that. So, as everybody's doing the first report, we're all learning this together. We'll have plenty of resources to help everybody work through that. The information from the INMP that gets carried over to the INMR is noted with an asterisk. So it'll be bolded and have an asterisk after it. So if you see that on the INMP, that means that's a particular piece of information that's going to be carried over into your INMR and will have to be reported. If it doesn't have that, then it means it's just something that's on your plan and it's never going to get reported. And then in your report, you'll include all of the INMPs that you have developed in that reporting timeline. So if you're a rotational vegetable grower and you have a lot of different INMPs for each vegetable rotation, that's all going to get lumped together in one report and submitted. For the sake of time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So the report, like I said, pulls over the parcel management section of the INMP. So, as you named your management unit, you listed all the all the APNs in it, the crop, age if needed, in the irrigated acres. All this gets added into your INMR. So you can see there's multiple lines here for multiple management unit IPNs that you would have. Page 2 is going to pull over all of the irrigation, harvest, and nitrogen management sections. So how much nitrogen did you apply? What was your harvest yield, et cetera. There's also going to be questions about, were you identified as an outlier the previous year? So for year one, that's going to be a no for everybody. For year two, that's going to be a yes for some people. You're going to note the certification method. So did you certify it yourself? Did you work with NRCS? Did you work with a CCA? Or are you an operator who has less than 10 acres and you didn't have to certify? And this is the table that's going to pull over all of those, the nitrogen per management unit applications, and then your harvest yield information. There are a couple of provisions for what's called alternative reportings. This would be exemptions from yield reporting. So if you are a grower who meets any of these qualifications, then you still have to do your plan. You still have to report on it. The one thing that you are exempt from doing is reporting your yield. So you don't have to actually measure, quantify, and report the yield. The first box is going to be really difficult for folks to meet because of the first two, really the first point. So this is an and statement. You would have to meet all three of these. Operators operate in an area with evidence of no or very little nitrogen impacts to surface or groundwater. Because of that TMDL map that I showed earlier, we have nitrogen TMDLs that span almost the entire county. It's going to be really hard to demonstrate that you are in an area that doesn't have nitrogen impacts. So even if you have difficulty measuring yield, it's going to be hard to meet these first three. If you are a diversified socially disadvantaged grower with a maximum total acreage of 45 acres, maximum gross sales of 350,000, and a high crop diversity, you're meeting all of those, then you wouldn't have to report your yield. This might apply for some small flower growers or some small nursery operators, some small kind of high crop diversity growers who are growing for like a farmer's market, that kind of a thing. And then same one down here at the bottom, but without that socially disadvantaged criteria added into it. So if anybody thinks that that might apply, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. If that does apply to you, then you would check these boxes here on the INMP and then the INMR. And then this is just pulling over the irrigation methods and management practice information. And again, the deadlines that I noted before, so the INMR is due March 1st of 2026. Okay, my last section here, which I'll cover pretty quickly, is statistical outliers. So this is kind of what the outcome is of reporting and what we're doing with some of this information. So the first step is submitting the data to VCOG. We anonymize that and then we report it to the regional board. We look at a couple of metrics on that. So there's an A over R ratio, so your applied nitrogen over your removed nitrogen, as well as an A minus R difference that's calculated. And that'll be calculated per acre. So how many pounds of nitrogen were applied per acre of your orchard, and then how many pounds of nitrogen were removed in that harvest yield. So your applied is your fertilizer, your organic amendments, and then any nitrogen in your irrigation water, and your removed is your harvest yield multiplied by that removal coefficient. We're going to look at growers of the same crop type. So that's where that standard crop name becomes really important. Because we'll be able to say for all lemon growers who have trees within this age range, we're going to plot everything on a distribution curve and look to see kind of, where we have most growers and where there are outliers. So that outlier threshold will be determined in looking at that data. Anybody who's above that would be an outlier. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one might be there's more nitrogen application than the crop needs. So as a grower who's just applying more nitrogen than their peers who are growing that same commodity type. There might be inefficiency in the application or irrigation practices. Or there might be things that are more outside of your control. There could be crop failure. Maybe you had, Santa Ana wind event that came through and blew all the fruit off your trees, or you had a pest pressure issue, or you just had lower yields than you were anticipating for some environmental reason. Or there could be reporting errors. So it's really important to make sure that what you are reporting has been verified. So these are a couple of reasons for that. Some of those are within your control, some of those are without or kind of outside of your control. And then this is kind of the general format of what that notification would look like. So this is an example of the Kern River Water Coalition Authority. So because we haven't built this in Clearwater yet, I don't have a view of what this is going to look like, but you'll see for each management unit kind of where the means are, where you are in relation to your peers. And if you are identified as an outlier, you would get that notification from VCALG. And there's a couple purposes for identifying outliers. First is that it's feedback. So it's feedback to the growers to say, if you are identified as an outlier, maybe there's something you need to look at in your irrigation or fertilization program that could be refined. So it's something to kind of help you look into that. And then also to help growers improve practices. So if it was something that was due to any sort of inefficiency or over application, then that's something that could be improved. And there would be, I have a slide on this. So there would be some focused education that growers would have to attend. So if you are identified as an outlier, it really just means you're going to have to attend some workshops that focus on improving irrigation or nutrient management efficiency. And then you would have to mark that on future reports that you were previously identified as an outlier. Because if a grower were to continue being identified as an outlier year after year after year, then that might be something that would drive the regional board to, contact the grower, want to know more about what's going on and see if there's anything that can be done to improve that practice. And we're still haven't put together what that full outlier identification process and follow-up program looks like. That's something that VCALG needs to submit to the regional board for approval early next year, I think. So once we do that and the regional board signs off on that, we'll have more information about what that really looks like. And that is it for my slides. So are there any questions before I turn it over to Andre? Go ahead. Can you use the microphone, Felix? Right in front of you. Can you use a microphone so folks online can hear you? You press the button, it'll turn green. You press the button. Sorry. There you go.
There you go. Management unit ID, is that something that's provided to us or is something, some name we make up? Or
Good
what is
question. Yeah, totally a name you make up. Whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
Like cilantro planting, 2025. Whatever, block name, whatever makes sense to you that you can identify that. That is, yeah, that's a name that you give it. We'll give it its own unique identifier, anonymous number ID, but yeah.
Okay. Can you go back to the strawberry calendar, please?
Calendar, yeah. Oops, sorry. New preview of honors content.
So for example, we have crops in the ground now that were recently planted. We're going to harvest some in the fall of 2024. So, November, December, we'll harvest some. The bulk is going to be, January on 2025. So can you repeat it's not clear to me, the calendar process, because I mean, we can know starting January, we can know how much fertilizer we're going to use, how much water we're going to use for 25, even though the crop was planted in 24.
Yeah, this might help answer anything that you have in the ground before 2025. So before January 1st, 2025, you can ignore. There's nothing you have to do for that planting.
Okay, so then we plant again, let's say in October, we plant again. So we have to have a plan for that, but the due date has already passed because the due date, you said it was March 1st. So on March 1st, we need to have a plan for we're going to plant in October anyways.
So your future, yep.
Yes. Okay, yep. So we'll have
if you know what you're planting in October. If you already know, then you should have your plan. But things are dynamic, things change. The March 1st requirement to have your plan, definitely applies for perennial crop growers, because that's in the ground, you know it. For annual crop growers, you just need to have that plan at least by the time it's established.
Okay. And then in 26, by March 1st of 26, we report, as you said, we report nothing because the crop is not done,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You would just submit a report that says no completed, and we'll have kind of a drop down thing that you can select. So you would log into Clearwater, you would select for these parcels, I have nothing to report because I didn't have a completed crop cycle in 2025. And that's
Okay.
what you'd be submitting on March 1st of 2026.
Okay, so it wouldn't be until 27 then.
Yeah,
Got it.
that you'd actually be reporting anything substantial.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, so the question is whether the regional board would be amenable to like a deadline that would be more guided by your actual planting a little bit before and then your report a little bit after. I think there is a little bit of that flexibility for developing your plan. So like I said, like you just have to have a plan for either what you know that you're going to plant in that future year, or at least by the time that you put it in the ground. So there is flexibility there. The reporting aspect of it, less flexibility because it's actually something that's being reported. You can report at any time. You don't have to wait until, you shouldn't wait until March 1st because that's when it's due. So if you complete a harvest in, let's use like next year as an example. If you complete your harvest in June of 2026, you can submit your report then. You don't have to wait until March of 2027 to submit your report. You'll be able to log into Clearwater at any time, submit your report, and then be done with it.
I think I met most of you guys. My name is Andre Biscaro, and I work for UC Extension. So we'll be talking about the 3 different aspects today here related to water in irrigation. First one, we'll cover a little bit of the nitrogen cycle very quickly. And we're talking about the process that affect the most the efficiency of our irrigation and nitrogen management systems. And then we'll talk a little bit about irrigation and irrigation efficiency and how that's related to nitrogen use efficiency also, okay? So there are different forms of nitrogen. So we can basically think of organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen. And the main difference is that the organic nitrogen is not plant available, right? So it's not available for the crop. It's usually carbon and nitrogen molecules linked together. And then you have the inorganic nitrogen that's directly available. That's ammonium and nitrate. Those are 2 forms of nitrogen that you really want to keep in mind. If there is a message to go home, is really you want to understand the difference between ammonium and nitrate. And we'll be talking a little bit about it. But basically, those are the 2 forms in there, predominantly in the soil. Most of the time, the majority of the nitrogen in the soil, the available plant nitrogen in the soil, be in the form of nitrate. And that's because the ammonium is converted to nitrate through the nitrification process. So we'll talk a little bit about it, but except this is an exception only, the exception only is when you're applying like heavily fertilizers that are mostly ammonium-based fertilizers. So for that time of, like if you apply something like that, like an ammonium sulfate, and you come and take a soil sample, a lot of that nitrogen would be in the form of ammonium, but then it's just a matter of time that ammonia will be nitrified and become nitrate. And the nitrate obviously is susceptible to leaching, and we'll be discussing this a little bit. Now, this is a graph for the nitrogen cycle, so you can see there are different forms of nitrogen in here in the soil. Organic matter, so nitrogen is in the organic form, and it can become, and it can go to the mineral form through the mineralization process. This is driven by microbes. So from organic nitrogen goes to mineral nitrogen in the ammonium form, and then goes to the nitrate form through the nitrification of another microbe-driven process. And then you have in here leaching, right, of this nitrate. Nitrate is negatively charged, so it's not held in the soil CEC, and it's soluble in water, so it moves with water. So those are the two main differences between ammonium and nitrate, right? Nitrate is easily leachable, so it moves with water, and ammonium is usually held in the soil CEC. And then you have the assimilation of the nitrate and the ammonium in the plant. And you have also the immobilization of the ammonium going back to the organic matter. And that's usually driven by a high CN ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio. And we'll be discussing later. This is also a microbe-driven process, okay? And then in here you have the denitrification process when you have a large pool of nitrate that's in a saturated condition in the soil that usually leads to denitrification. Oops, I just went forward. Well, maybe it's time to move forward. So, and again, I'll be going quickly through these examples in here. There's a lot to cover, but since this is a refresher, I hope you guys still retain some of these concepts of the nitrogen cycle, of the nitrogen, the chemistry and biology involved into these cycles in here. But one important thing to remember again is that soil microbes drive a lot of these processes in here. So in the case of the nitrogen mineralization, that's mostly driven by the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And what's the carbon to nitrogen ratio? So when you get an organic material and you send to the lab, and you get the resulting how many ppms of nitrogen, for example, there is, and how many ppms of carbon there is. When you divide those two, you get a ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So when this ratio is lower than 20, let's just say 15, 10, 5, that means this process, the interaction of the microbes and the organic material usually leads to the mineralization, usually leads to the microbe leaving ammonium as a byproduct of their activity in the soil. Now, when this carbon to nitrogen ratio is 35 and above, that leads to the immobilization. That means some of this nitrogen that's in the mineral form, like ammonium and nitrate hanging out in the soil, will be used by these microorganisms and become part of the organic matter. And that's not available anymore to the plants. Maybe you guys have heard of the term tying up nitrogen, right? So when you use organic amendments that's very fiberish, that has a lot of carbon or high carbon to nitrogen ratio, that usually ties up your nitrogen, okay? And also the nitrification, another process that's driven by these microbes. So you have the ammonium, and then that ammonia is converted to nitrate by the microbes. And all these processes in here are largely also driven by temperature and moisture of the soil. If you have a good moisture, not excessive and not too dry, and the higher the temperature, the higher this process, the faster these processes will occur, okay? And again, nitrate is highly leachable. So that's mostly why you guys are here today. That's why we're here today, is because, we found, like, not we, but, there's been studies showing high concentration of nitrate in groundwater. And so we're here to understand this process and try to incorporate some of these learnings to your management practices so we can decrease the escape and the leaching of this nitrate to groundwater. So nitrate, again, is negatively charged, so it's not held in the soil, moves freely in the soil, and also it's highly soluble in water, so it moves with the water. All right, any questions, comments on the cycle, nitrogen cycle, ammonium nitrate? Any? Yes. Yeah, urea will leach in the form of urea. So if you apply a high rate of urea through the irrigation and you keep pushing the water past the root zone, it will leach, yes. But so the idea is to put that urea in the root zone and wait until it becomes like ammonium, right? And then it will be uptake by the crop. So just for the folks on Zoom to understand your question. So the folk in here, the gentleman here is asking about basically how to convert, right? Or like how to know how many pounds of nitrogen you're applying once you're using like a urea, right? So we're going to be talking about that mostly, I think, in towards the last of the presentation. So we'll get into more details. But yeah, basically have to use the concentration, and in a liquid fertilizer, also have to use the density of the fertilizer. If you're using dry urea, then you just use the concentration of the nitrogen and the weight used. Sounds good? Yeah. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. This is very basic, right, folks? But let's move forward. And now we're talking about irrigation and nitrogen management with the object of describing the relationship between irrigation nitrogen management, thinking of efficiency of both irrigation and nitrogen fertilization, and to differentiate between irrigation efficiency and distribution uniformity. So what we see here on the left is an illustration of efficient irrigation and fertilization of nitrogen, where you see the water and the nitrate illustrated with the red dots is staying mostly around the root zone. And in here is when you have an excessive irrigation that moves a lot of that nitrate past the root zone. So that's why we're discussing irrigation management in a nitrogen focused workshop, right? So you want to have control. You want to make sure that the water that you apply stay mostly in the root zone to avoid the leaching of your nitrogen. So irrigation efficiency can be defined as a percentage of applied water that's beneficially used. What's it can be like this. You can see this term as like a vague term, but think of the different objectives that we have with irrigation, not only providing water for crop demand, like evapotranspiration, right? Evaporation and transpiration. We'll be discussing some of these details coming up later, but we're also trying to address leaching the salts, climate control, and some other parameters too that some growers will use as beneficial, okay? And by the way, you can interrupt me anytime, the folks on Zoom too. So we're trying to make this a little less formal since this is a refresher. So distribution uniformity is basically a measure of how evenly the water is applied in the field, okay? We'll show some examples like illustrations of distribution uniformity. You get a good grasp for what it is from these illustrations, but basically a good distribution uniformity is above 0.85 or 85% for drip, micro sprinklers, and sprinkler systems. And then you have furrow and flood, and these irrigation methods are not very common in here, but a good distribution uniformity for those methods would be about 0.7 or 70%. So what you see here in the illustration is sections of the field that received a lot more water than other parts, right? Where your targets right here, let's just say this is 1.5 inch, you're supposed to bring your soil moisture all the way down to about here. This is where your soil moisture should be at saturation, the whole profile in here where the roots are. But what's happening here is that you're moving the water past the root zone by a large amount in here, or in here, you're not irrigating enough. So you want to make sure that your field has an irrigation system that's applying what you intend to apply. So something like this, right? So if this is the 1.5 inch you're trying to apply, that's where you want to keep the water. There will be some variations. No system is perfect, but there are these efficiency numbers that you want to keep in mind. For example, like 0.85 or 85%. That's a good number for the irrigation systems we use around here. So this is an example with real numbers showing what a DU of 0.9 or 90% is for an application rate of 1.5. You see the variation goes from the smallest number, 135, to 165. So this is basically inches of water applied in different sections of the field with the same irrigation system, but just in different portions. The drive of this difference is mostly pressure. we'll talk about the main drivers, but the main one is pressure. So if you keep your pressure uniform throughout your irrigation system, most likely you're going to achieve real good distribution uniformity. So, and this is an example of a DU of a 0.7 with a target of 1.5, but you see here in sections of the field, you're getting just about an inch. In other sections, you're getting double of that, right? So then you have a sort of like a borderline efficient towards maybe more inefficient system, depending on what irrigation system you have. So if you haven't done your distribution of uniformity assessment recently, you can always reach out to the Ventura County RCD, and they usually have grants to support assessing your distribution uniformity from local farms, okay? So let's talk about irrigation methods. You guys have any questions on DU? DU, irrigation efficiency, and of that? Yes, Felix. No, no, it's not a requirement. It's just that like, and a lot of this, what I am discussing today is like it, let me see. Yeah, I don't think most of what I'm discussing is a requirement. It's more like the praxis that will help you relate to the fields the boxes that you have to fill out in the worksheet. So it's more like that. Yeah, it's not required. Mm-hmm.
So here in section 1, pre-season planning, you have box number 1, crop evapotranspiration.
Yeah.
In inches.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, it's something we have information of for different crops, whether you plant celery and.
Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about this later, but there's some information out there. There are estimations. Every year is different, right? And but we can get some good estimates, and we'll be discussing this later on. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? All right, let's move on. So irrigation methods. So this is quite simple. So the learning objectives in here to identify the role of the primary irrigation method, which, it's not surprise, that's to deliver water to the crops, right? And then to identify common uses for secondary irrigation methods. So when you go to box 14, you see irrigation methods as primary and secondary. So let's just use this case of strawberry. The primary irrigation method is the drip tape. And secondary could it be a micro sprinklers or could it be overhead sprinklers? Okay, that's usually used for establishing the crop. So then when you go to box 15, you need to choose the source. Is it a well? It's a water agency, recycled water. So also fairly simple. So an example of secondary irrigation, again, is for establishing strawberries. Those are the micro sprinklers. Sometimes that can be used for climate control. For example, when we had these strong Santa Ana winds that are warm and dry, a lot of growers like to bring the temperature down, provide some moisture on top of the root zone for the plants. So that can be used. In the case of the citrus, I've seen a few growers now are start using sprinklers on top of the canopy to help with bringing the temperature down for some heat events, okay? So that would be a secondary use. The primary use is to deliver water for the crop ET, for the beneficial uses. So let's talk about crop evapotranspiration, right? So with the objectives in here of estimating potential crop ET, crop evapotranspiration for a growing season, and also to recall where to find resources for estimating crop ET. So I think this is what you're referring to, right, Felix? Like on box 1, crop ET. So this is the pre-season, right? So before planting, pre-season planting, let's just discuss a little bit the concept of ET. Basically, that's the water used through transpiration of the plants. So the water that's taken up by the roots and that transpire through the leaves. and then the evaporation of the water from the surface of the soil and from the surface of the leaf as well, okay? That's crop ET. It's a very common term used in irrigation, and for estimating crop ET, you can use you can calculate ET using the reference ET from a weather station. So we have the public stations like the CIMS. The University of California is actually starting next month. We're installing 2 new stations in the county, and we'll be providing this information for free to you guys, so you guys can also access them and understand what the crop ET for the reference evapotranspiration is for that station. And then you multiply the crop, the reference ETO by the crop coefficient, and I'll provide an example coming up on the next page, to get your season ET, okay? So basically you get the reference evapotranspiration for the whole season multiplied by the crop coefficient. Every crop and every growth stage has its own crop coefficient. So this would be easier for orchards than it is for annual crops, but there are different ways of doing this. And you can also use the seasonal ET estimate provided by the Fox Canyon GMA, which can be found in there. So those numbers were numbers that were discussed years ago. Crop water use values that resonate to the different crops in regions, and dry, typical, and wet year for the region. So I think that table is there, and I'll show you some examples later. But let's just discuss the concept of estimating crop ET. Basically, this is a weather station. It's probably one of the CIMS station. So you can go online, download this reference evapotranspiration data. That is ETO, and multiply by the crop coefficient. Again, every crop and every crop stage will have its own crop coefficient. And then you get the ETC, or the crop evapotranspiration information that you need to put on box number 1. So this is an example for lemons in Saticoy with a KC of a 0.65 and an ETO for the whole season of 40 inches, or reference evapotranspiration of 40 inches. You have a crop ET of 26 inches. Okay, basically it's a super basic math. You multiply the KC by the ETO and you get how many inches you expect that crop to be using. The option number 2 is this table in here. If you go to the website from the link shared in the previous page, you see here there are multiple crops with different regions: Oxnard, I think this is Camarillo, and Santa Paula. And within each region, you have a dry, a typical, and a wet year. And you can see values that you should be pretty close to what your crop ET of your crop water requirements should be for the whole season on that table. So this might be an easier approach to do, because if you do use records from the weather station, you probably want to use like the monthly average, right? And then so you don't get like an odd year if you try to get a year, because you're doing this in anticipation of your crop, right? You're not doing this as after your crop, so you don't, after you grew your crop, so you don't know what the ETO is going to be. Alrighty, so any questions on the previous slides? Crop ET, how to calculate ET, where to get the reference evapotranspiration data. All right, let's move on to anticipated crop irrigation. So the objective here is to estimate the leaching requirements for a crop. And we'll be discussing the parameters that we use for that, and to estimate that maximum anticipated crop irrigation rate. So when you look into box number 2, you see anticipated crop irrigation. So that's the amount of inches that is done with the data that's provided from the crop ET that we just learned how to calculate, plus additional water requirements and irrigation efficiency. So we talked a little bit about irrigation efficiency, right? We're talking about additional water requirements. So additional water requirements, in addition to the main water that goes to the plant evapotranspiration, is used to leach salts, to germinate and establish crops, and for climate control, right? So those are additional water use. So leaching salts usually require us to understand what is the threshold, the salinity threshold in the soil that starts hurting yield, that starts decreasing yield. And then there's a quick formula that's shown in here. It's quite simple. So this is your leaching requirement, and this is the EC of the irrigation water, and this is the EC of the soil that is the threshold for start reducing or affecting your yields. So this is published, and we can share some of these numbers with you. It's a little tricky to convert these numbers to the reality of our soils and water quality in this region, because these numbers were developed mostly with Colorado River water, which is heavy on chloride and sodium. So what drives most of the EC of our of our irrigation and soils in here is bicarbonates and sulfates. So these numbers don't totally apply, but we can use them as a reference, okay? So let's see, I think there's an example in here. There's an example here with an orange orchard in Moore Park that has a water salinity of 1.3 decisims per meter. So 1.3 is pretty common, 1.3, 1.2. By the way, we're like in the United Water building right now. The EC of the United Water, if any of you guys get United Water, varies from 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, so it stays around that range. And then you have the soil salinity threshold for oranges is 1.7. So that's 1.7 decisims per meter done with the saturated paste extract. So that's why you have E in here, it's ECE, is the EC of the saturated paste extract of the soil. So if that number is 1.7, you multiply that by 5, and in here, EC of the water, 1.3. And anybody has made the calculation here? No? So I'll tell you, it's 18, should be 18% of leaching fraction when you have those numbers. So pretty simple calculation, right? All right, let's move on. So let's talk about irrigation set times. So the learning objective in here is to estimate irrigation set times based on a desired water application in inches. So this is something that I've, the more I work with growers, the more I work with farm managers, the more I understand that there's a disconnect between understanding if your crop needs 1, 2, or 3 hours, what that translates to volume of water. And what we call volume of water is usually inches of water. Why do we call volume? We use inches because we're thinking of an acre. When we think of an inch of water, we're thinking of an acre inch. So is the tap of water in 1 acre. So thinking 3-dimensional volume, okay? So there are basically 2 ways to determine your set times. One is using flow meter data, and the other one is using your system application rate. I usually use this for every field I work at. I think it's more straightforward. Every grower or farm manager should know what the application rate of your system is, meaning how many inches per hour are we applying. Let's just say you decide to apply 3 hours, how many inches is that? If you know your application rates, you know the volume of water you're applying. Let's look at this example of the flow meter rate, or let's use the flow meter runtime, the flow rate runtime. So the time you should run your water, your irrigation system to an application of a certain application of water, let's just say 2 inches. So the time would be determined by, you put 2 inches time, so many acres times 43560, how many square feet there is in an acre, divided by 96.3 times the flow rate of your well. Of your, if you have all the wells in here have a flow meter, right? So you'll be measuring, you'll be looking the flow rate. Let's just say that's 800 gallons per minute. You put 800 in here, how many acres you're irrigating, and the amount of water that you need to apply. So pretty simple. Now, I like to use this, that the runtime is determined by the irrigation, the water application, how much you're applying, the same information that you're inputting in the calculation from the previous method, but you're using the application rate, inches per hour. Remember, we just discussed about this. So if you, let's just say if you're using growing strawberries, you're using 3 tapes of medium flow, and you're growing on a 64-inch bed, the application rate should be about 0.24 inches per hour. If you're growing vegetables and you're 40 inches bed and using low flow tape, your application rate should be about 0.1 inches per hour, right? So knowing, if you don't know that, you can make a calculation that's very easy. You can just figure out what's the length of the tape that you have in an acre. And then based on the tape manufacturer's information, you can look into the discharge rate, how many gallons per minute per 100 feet you get on that tape. And then you make an extrapolation for an acre, convert gallons to inches, and then you get your application rate, right? Same thing for emitters. Calculate how many emitters or sprinklers you have in an acre, and then you should get your application rate. Sounds good. But if you guys don't know how to make that calculation, you should definitely contact the company that set up your irrigation system. They'll know, and they'll get that to you. So before we talk about irrigation water nitrogen concentration, basically estimating how much nitrogen you're putting through your irrigation water, you guys have any questions on what we just discussed? Yes. I don't know. It's probably a factor once you're accounting for all units and everything. So yeah. Yeah, good question. So it basically he asked where the 96.3 comes from. I don't know, but it's there like a lot of formulas, and this is correct. So if you use it, it works. So yeah, pi pi multiplied by 30 maybe something like that. Was pi, is it pi like 3.14 something like that? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No? Oh, you guys are easy group. Let's just keep moving. So in here, we'll be describing how to sample irrigation water for nitrate nitrogen and estimate the concentration of nitrate nitrogen in irrigation water sample. So when you look at your worksheet in box number 3, you see it asks for the irrigation water nitrogen concentration. So this can be reported as ppm or milligrams per liter. But one thing you want to pay attention is this requirement here is in nitrate nitrogen, okay? So it's not in nitrate only, nitrate nitrogen. And yeah, so I'll be showing what the difference between nitrate, nitrogen, and nitrate, but two easy ways that you can determine how much nitrate you have in irrigation water is to one is to take a sample and send it to the lab. And if you send it to the fruit growers lab, they'll get a irrigation solubility test that includes nitrate, and they'll report in nitrate nitrogen for you. And then you can also do the quick test. So if you have interest in doing the quick tests, you can buy these strips online. It's a strip you dip in the water and you let it sit for a minute, and then you compare the color of the strip to the scale that they give you, and then you can estimate if you're like around 10, 20, 30 ppms of nitrate with your water. So quite simple, efficient, cheap also. These strips are sold for about $100 with 100 strips. So it costs about $1 per strip. And you can also use that for determining how much nitrate there is in your soil. There's a method for that. I'll talk a little bit about it. But this is the main difference when you're reporting nitrate only, you're reporting the whole molecule. And when you're reporting nitrate nitrogen, you're reporting just the nitrogen in the nitrate molecule. Okay? So the main difference is that nitrate nitrogen is nitrate multiplied by 0.23. So if you ever get these results from a lab in nitrate, you multiply that by 0.23 to get nitrate nitrogen. And again, this is showing just that ppms is equivalent to milligrams per liter. Now there's a little example in here for, let's just say, one crop that, well, before we get to the calculation, so why is it important for us to understand the concentration of nitrate in the irrigation water? Because the nitrate that comes with the irrigation water can be used and is a source of nitrogen for your crop, right? So with this processing here of estimating how much nitrogen you're putting for the whole cycle and how much nitrogen you're putting through fertilizers, through compost, through different sources, this is another source. The irrigation water is another source. So it's quite simple to calculate how much nitrogen you're adding through the irrigation water. Basically, you need to know two things. One is the volume of water that you're applying, and the other one is the concentration of the nitrate that you have in that water. How you determine the concentration of nitrate in the water? Send the sample to the lab or use the quick test. Now you have the concentration, and in this case in here, we're using a concentration of 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate nitrogen, or 10 ppms of nitrate nitrogen, right? The other variable is volume. So using two examples in here with volume. One example is 1.5 acre feet, and the other example is 2.5. That's just to give you an idea of how many pounds of nitrogen you get with a typical volume of water used for our crops in here. Most crops are between 1.5 and 2.5 acre feet of water, and 10 ppms of nitrate nitrogen actually for this region here is high. Most of our wells do not have nitrate, and the ones that have is usually below 10 ppms, okay? Any questions on that? Yes, Felix, microphone, please.
Sorry about that. Not used to this. So we can use the strip to measure the nitrogen in the water. We can use the pens. You've seen them. We use them all the time. Both of those will give you a read on how much nitrogen. Now, in a case of some kind of audit in the future, how are we gonna back that up if we use a strip? So if we have a report from an accredited lab and we get audited, we can say, hey, I send in the sample, this, this well, here's the number. I'm not making this up. If we use a strip, I mean, you're saying it's valid to measure the nitrogen. We know it's valid. How are we gonna back that up in case of an audit?
Before I defer to Jody to just, I don't think I'll let her speak to like validating that number that you got. But one thing to think about is the nitrate concentration in irrigation water doesn't usually change dramatically within the season and over like the next couple of years. It's usually something, obviously this depends on the hydrogeology of the region, the depth of the groundwater, and how you're managing nitrogen and that's in irrigation, that sort of thing, rainfall patterns, and when the rainfall, when you're getting a lot of water for like the high nitrogen use part of your crop season, right? So, but that being said, that in most cases you have a constant or similar concentration of nitrogen in your irrigation water. I'll let Jody chime in on the requirements for that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't worry about any situation where the regional board would want to see documentation of what your nitrate concentration is in your irrigation water. It's really just about, are you taking that sample and measuring it and accounting for it in your overall nitrogen budget? Are you engaged in the process and taking measurements and really accounting for that in your total nitrogen source compilation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in other words, they want you to make the math, right? They want to have like consultants and growers to be more familiar with the process. And so in case you have some nitrate in your irrigation water, they want us to make the calculation and add to the planning, right? So I think this would be more critical for other regions where they have like a large number of groundwater, like wells with high levels of nitrate. So we have like a quite limited numbers here. So kudos to you guys doing a great job. So sounds good. Yeah. Yeah. Oops. So irrigation efficiency practices. So we'll be discussing how to identify management practices and tools that can increase irrigation efficiency. So when you look into box 16, you have a few options, and those options include laser leveling, distribution uniformity test that we discussed, use of ET and CIMS data for determining how much to apply for each irrigation, use of soil moisture sensors, um, variable speed water pump, and others. So anything that you're using that helps with managing water, you should add in that, okay? So again, irrigation efficiency is a percentage of the water that is beneficially used. So it's influenced by the irrigation scheduling and maintenance, okay? What's irrigation scheduling? Irrigation scheduling is determining how much water to apply in each irrigation and when. Do you wait until tomorrow, until Thursday, Friday? So this is scheduling how much to apply and when to apply. Okay, is it an hour, 2, 3? Is it this morning, tomorrow, the day after? Scheduling. This is a big driver of your productivity, of your yield. You're optimize. With that scheduling. Basically, you're optimizing water availability for your crop. You're maintaining the root zone. You're trying to maintain uh, uh, soil moisture optimal in the root zone. So the crop always has that water available when it needs, but also the nutrients that come from the soil. Now, you have different approaches. We can divide these approaches in 3 for irrigation scheduling. One is the soil, and obviously soil moisture sensors is the main example for that. So in this case in here, you see a tensiometer and a watermark, 2 of the most used soil moisture sensors in the region. And then for plant, you have different approaches. You have dendrometers, you have sap flow, we have a pressure bomb, right? So different methods. Those are it takes a little more work. Some of these methods, they're more specific for tree crops, not using annual crops mostly, or yeah. And then you have the weather-based approach. This is mostly to determine, so while this two in here helps with determining when to irrigate, when the water is, when the plants or the crop is reaching a point where it's getting to a certain level of stress or it's getting close to a level that will affect yield, that's the right time. And that's when you irrigate. You don't want to past the point where it's really hard for the plant to extract the water from the soil. So use these approaches in here. Now, for the weather, that's the other side of the equation is how long to irrigate, right? Is the volume of water. Are you putting 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? So weather station data really helps with that because you can associate that information with crop coefficient and for each crop it has its own crop coefficient, crop stage. We discussed about it. So now there are basically two types of soil moisture sensors out there. There are multiple brands and multiple devices, but when you think of like what they measure, basically two. One measures water tension, meaning how hard it is to extract the water from the soil. Those are the tensiometers. And the volumetric water content sensors, those measure basically a proportion of water by a volume of soil. Let's just say this is my volume of soil that the volumetric water content sensor typically measures, maybe a liter, 2 liters, a quarter to half gallon. And then let's just say 30% of that is water. So that's what those sensors measure. They'll give you a reading of 0.3 or 30%. That's a proportion of that volume of soil that has water, okay? Or how much water that soil has. I really prefer tensiometers. That's a direct measure of how difficult it is for the plant to get water. When you're using these sensors in here, when you change from a clay soil to a sandy soil, that threshold that we use, let's just say you're looking at soil moisture content and it's going from 0.3, 0.5, 0.3, 0.35, 0.4, that threshold changes from a clay soil to a sandy soil. 0.35 for a clay soil can be a lot harder to get water than compared to a sandy soil and vice versa. Okay, so this doesn't happen with the tensiometers. With the tensiometers, the tension is what the plant experiences. Now, with the weather-based method, the ET-based method, basically this setting here of multiple sensors we call weather stations. So you have temperature and relative humidity here. You have net radiometer in here. You have pyranometer in here. You have, I think this is the wind speed, wind direction. So we use all these measurements here to understand how much water is actually evapotranspirating from this weather station. And these weather stations are usually surrounded by well-watered grass. That's what we call reference evapotranspiration, because it's measured under a reference, a standard surface, okay? So you get this ETO in here. The ET is usually, we talk ET, evapotranspiration. Crop ET is the water that leaves the crop. ETO is what's measured in the weather station, okay? So, and we discussed a little bit about how to use that information. Basically multiply by the crop coefficient, right? If you want to do for the whole season, you assume a crop coefficient for the whole season, easier done for tree crops. Now, if you're doing every irrigation, there are applications to do that. But if you want to do by hand, download the reference evapotranspiration data from the weather station since your last irrigation and multiplying by the crop coefficient, okay? Now, maintenance, obviously you want to, just like a few reminders in here, how to improve irrigation efficiency by maintaining your system, basically cleaning and inspecting from damages like leaks in here in the lines, or you want to make sure your electronics, your flow meters are working, pressure regulators, and all the sensors and equipment that helps with maintaining and monitoring your system. Now, filters, obviously, they need to be flushed, they need to be cleaned. So you want to do maintenance periodically, cleaning emitters, flushing the lines. And this is especially true when you're using organic materials. Some of these products are not nearly as clean as like a potassium nitrate or ammonium nitrate or calcium nitrate. So these products usually come with organic material, or they can actually induce the growth of bacteria and algae in the emitters, in your irrigation system. So you want to make sure the system is well maintained, and you always want to have one of these. This is a pressure gauge. You can check the pressure for your irrigation lines in the multiple points of your irrigation system. Again, one of the most efficient ways of making sure that your distribution uniformity is as good as it can be, right? Is maintaining good pressure throughout the system. What's good pressure? The pressure that is your irrigation system is designed for. Most drip tapes for berry and vegetable crops are designed to work at 8 psi. So you want to make sure your system, like you measure the pressure throughout your field, and the pressure should be about 7.5, 8, 8.5, right? So stay around where the manufacturer recommends. Also, other efficiency practices that should be adding to your worksheet is laser leveling, variable frequency drivers for irrigation, and pressure compensating emitters, okay? Any questions on the topic of irrigation and determining how long to irrigate or when's the right time to irrigate? Yes. Can you repeat your question in the microphone?
What if you have limited amount of water?
Yes.
You cannot say, okay, you go and check your tensiometers and
Yeah.
they're asking you that you need water tomorrow or day
Yeah.
after,
Yeah.
or you got too much water today and tomorrow maybe right time, but you don't have water until a week.
Yeah.
I mean, you got a schedule.
Yes.
You have to wait for
Right.
that schedule. So
Yeah.
doing that point.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's all about strategy, right? Because there's nothing you can do if you want to, like, if your
You can
soil,
mix.
if your soil moisture is like you're getting to like a dry, you know, if you're growing avocados, you're up in the hills and you're depending on the water schedule for the water agency from who you're getting water from, and then you only have water 3 days a week. So you can try to plan for that. You can see like when, that's why I like when you use tensiometers. That's why I like to use the ones that are attached to a computer box that shows the data on a graph. You can access the data from the phone, from your computer, and then you see a graph. So one thing is to come to your field and look at a soil moisture of a 10 centibars right there in the gauge. The other thing totally different is when you see that data on a graph, because you can see that 10 centibars on a curve going up very fast, or you can see that 10 centibars on a curve going steady, just like with like a low slope, right? Going up. Then you can wait, right? Let's just say you're at 10, but you're only getting, today is Tuesday, you only get your water on Thursday. In a situation where you have a small slope, your soil moisture is not declining very quickly, you can wait. But let's just say it's going very fast and you have water today and you know, okay, most likely my soil moisture will deplete very quickly in the next couple of days, especially considering the forecast, in case the forecast is favorable of high ET. So that's usually high temperature, low moisture content, high wind. So then you anticipate for that. But you know, those are the only things I can come up with.
Little.
Yeah, a little, yeah, it's some strategy, right? But understanding, like you really understanding if that 10 bar is coming in slow or if it's coming in hot, that's key. And you can only see that when you have your tensiometer attached to a data logger, right? A data logger that you have access from your computer to.
Don't even have internet there.
You don't have any, yeah. So yeah, you have a harder task then.
Mulch, yeah. They're
Oh.
hills. You cannot use tractors to bring mulch up there.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions, comments? All right. I feel like I've been talking for quite a bit in here. Maybe I passed my time, man. Yeah. So how many more slides do I have? Nitrogen efficiency price. So I'm gonna go through these fairly quick because I've gone over my time, but let's just define nitrogen use efficiency and describe the 4R principles. So nitrogen use efficiency is a measure of how well available nitrogen matches with nitrogen uptake of the crop. So we say available nitrogen because if we think of organic nitrogen, that's not available. So, and also nitrogen uptake of the crop is like you want to make sure that you're putting the right amount of nitrogen at the right time when the crop needs. So every crop has a different pattern of how many pounds of nitrogen it uses per day or per week for the season, right? Early season usually uses less, later season usually uses more. So in California, agriculture, about 70% is an average of an efficiency system, meaning for every 100 pounds you apply, 70% is used by the crop. Now, those are the 4R principles, very important. You really, every time you're choosing your fertilizer or you're applying your fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, you really want to think of the right, you really want to think of the right source, the right rate, time, and place. So obviously, for the right place, you want to keep the nitrogen in the plant mouth. That's where the plant takes the nitrogen. For the right time and rate, you really want to think of the nitrogen uptake of the crop. Early in the season, most crops uses less nitrogen. Later in the season, uses more. So you adjust the rate based on the timing of your crop system. Okay, and for box 18 and 17 and 18, that's where you add your nitrogen efficiency practices, the ones we discussed before. And nitrogen, some that we discussed before, and now the nitrogen application practices. You're splitting your nitrogen fertilization, you're fertigating your nitrogen, you're applying foliar, and that sort of thing. So soil available nitrogen. So describe how to take a representative soil sample. Basically, that's your box 11. So pre-season available nitrogen. Basically, we can take a sample, analyze this sample, and make a conversion of ppms of nitrogen in the soil to how many pounds of nitrogen in the soil there is. And this is what this requires. So basically, I'll go fairly quick on that. So you want to take a representative sample, meaning you want to take about 20 samples or 12 cores per management zone. And the management zone, obviously, you define based on your crop age, previous management in those regions, in those blocks. And so you take this sample, you either do the quick test or send to the lab. And then you again convert your result from nitrate to nitrogen by multiplying by 0.23. And then for the first foot of your soil, for the first 12 inches, if you're taking your sample from 0 to 12, you can multiply that by 4, and then you get how many pounds of nitrogen per acre you have on your soil, okay? So there's a quick example here. Basically, if you have a concentration of 20 ppms, you multiply that of nitrate, you multiply that by 0.23 to get nitrate nitrogen. And then that's the quick test. So there's a link in there that you can access on how to use, where to purchase the nitrate strip. And the main thing in here for the nitrogen in the irrigation water is to determine how many pounds of nitrogen you're applying. That we discussed this before. So let me see, this is box number 10, pounds of nitrogen that's coming from the irrigation water. So again, volume times the concentration of the nitrogen will give you how many pounds to apply, you're applying per irrigation. So CN ratio, we discussed this a little bit. So this is worksheet box number 9, organic amendments, manure, compost, and others. So those are some examples of organic amendments: compost, manure, plant-based fertilizer, animal-based fertilizer, plant-based fertilizer, cover crop residue, right? So those are organic amendments. You want to think of the CN ratio. So these are different examples of amendments for different CN ratios. and how much nitrogen is available after 12 weeks that these amendments are applied to the soil. So what you can see here is that the lowest, the CN ratio, the highest, the amount of nitrogen that's available after 12 weeks, okay? Those are estimations. Those are some resources. Those are all from the University of California. You can access them. They are great resources, and they will show you like examples, for example, like this calculator in here, where you add the region, the amendment used, the rate, the period of interest, so how many months since you applied that product, and you can tell the inches that you incorporated, and it'll give you a fairly decent estimation of when the nitrogen will be available after you applied, okay? And for the dry and liquid fertilizer, I believe I already covered most of it. So I think it's okay to transition to Ben, right? Yeah. So I'm sorry I went over my time. And if you have any quick question, I'd like to answer. If not, I'll pass it to Ben. No? Well, thank you.
There it is. Okay. Okay, so just real quick before I get started, since we are running over, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. We had allotted 30 minutes for my talk. I could probably crank this out in about 15. But if you have to leave at noon, the recording will be posted online after we're all completed, so you can go back and review any of this information. But just to get started here, we're going to clear up just a couple of points for the worksheet here, starting with production units and what these are. So the whole purpose of this idea of production units is so that you can appropriately label on your worksheet your yield, essentially. There are also going to be a few, and we'll identify those in the next slide, that will require just a little additional detail than just a label. If you're following along on the worksheet, we are at box 4 here, where there's the production unit entry there. Just for simplicity, I typically keep this in pounds or tons. I realize some crops are not harvested in pounds or tons, but there's typically a weight that goes along with every unit you're using, a field box or a bin or something like that. So you can do that conversion before putting it on the worksheet, or just make a note on the worksheet of what that weight for that particular unit is, so that can be done later. A couple exceptions to this. So I'm not sure if anybody in here is farming with any of these units, but if you're doing nursery plants, cut flowers, sod, or have a U-pick operation, production units for these are a little bit more ambiguous. For example, nursery plants, a unit or a pot, that could be a 5, a 15, to 20 gallon pot. They don't have a necessary designated weight, so you can just count the units and record those. But in that case, there won't be a tonnage or a pound associated with it, so we can't use that information to derive nitrogen recommendations. But in the spirit of the worksheet, you still need to record those units. Okay, so jumping into expected crop yield. So essentially what this is kind of a preseason estimate of what you're expecting to harvest off of your field at the end of the season. Keeping in mind, this is the harvested portion. Anything removed, anything left in the field does not get counted in this estimate. And then we'll touch just briefly on implications of overestimating that yield and what that could do. So again, if following along, here we are on box 5, and then box 13 in the harvest yield section will be essentially, for that A column, will essentially be the same projected yield estimate. We use that box 13 column down there on the bottom, this one down here. We use that as part of the preseason nitrogen applied planning. So we use that to calculate requirements for annuals and mature perennial crops, or you can. That's one method. Just use caution when estimating yield. Overestimating yield can lead to an over application of nitrogen if you're using that estimate to budget your end for the year. So keep that in mind. And then also just to note, it's okay to make adjustments to these estimates based on changing conditions in the field. Just got hit with some crazy winds. If you lost fruit, you obviously have to account for that sort of thing. Okay, so a method for doing these estimates, using a previous average for the last 3 to 5 years is a common way of doing it. You want to, in that case, make sure you account for any outliers. So if you have a particularly good or particularly bad year, you can remove those from that average. And then, of course, making adjustments based on any field conditions or market conditions. For example, if something didn't get harvested in one year because of a decline in price or something like that. So here's an example using the 3 to 5 year method for carrots. You can see there's one crossed out there. Looks like it's a bit of an outlier. So you just take the average of those remaining 4 years, that is, or seasons, to get an average for that particular field of 650 crates per acre. And then keep in mind that crates would have a pound unit attached to it as well. You can also, this is going to be a little bit less accurate, but you can use county crop reports to locate like an average yield per acre for your crop. I mean, again, you can go back several years and use averages similar to if you were using that particular field's information. Okay, so then this is going to be moving to end of the season, so your actual yield. You want to make sure this is accurately reported, because this number is then going to kind of be used to back calculate nitrogen removed for your A over R and your A minus R values, which we'll talk about here shortly. This is also, I think on the new form, there's a notes section, right? So you can, so if any circumstances that need to be recorded, loss of fruit, of loss of yield or something along those lines, would be done at this point in time. And you can indicate that on your sheet. So it's clear that there's a reason why there's a discrepancy between how much N you applied and maybe the yield that you anticipated but didn't quite meet. And I think that will be included in outlier determination too. So you want to make sure to note that information. Here we are in the worksheet again. So this is going to be moving over in column to the B column here. Okay, so again, reporting an accurate yield. This just ensures accurate evaluation of your N applied versus N removed, or in this case, your R value is the yield times your N removal coefficient, which Andre talked about a little bit, and where you can find those values for your crop. I've kind of mentioned this already as well, but things to note on the worksheet: anything pertaining to severe yield loss, if you have a fallowed ground or a crop that's non-bearing, so maybe a tree crop that's just been planted, not harvested yet, or not harvested at all. And then some of the more difficult to quantify operations like nursery, U-pick, sod, and such. And again, it is required that you report this information, and some of it will be considered when identifying outliers, which will be important. We can skip that, but basically, yes, if your field is fallowed, you still need to do one of these reports. Okay, so this is recommended and applied total N. We'll go through how to estimate total N required for the upcoming season, a couple different methods for that, and then calculating your total nitrogen applied based on all of your inputs. So this is where we're at on the worksheet, box 12 or row 12. And we'll be looking at columns A and B. So that's recommended is column A, and actual applied at the end of the year is going to be your column B. So here we'll work through these. So estimating nitrogen required, your nitrogen removed from the field with harvest, and then recommended N rates from field research, kind of the two methods here. So N removed with harvest, this can be used for orchard or field crops where the majority of crop residue is being removed with the harvest. In this case, your total N is going to be equal to the expected yield. So again, that's your yield estimate times the N removal coefficient, which can be found in this link here. So there's a QR code that'll take you to the coefficients, divided by your nitrogen use efficiency, which Andre went over. Okay, so some mature orchard crops, they do require additional nitrogen for just perennial tissue growth. This is above and beyond any N that you're applying to feed the fruit for harvest. So we'll go over just real quickly what this looks like. This is a form that we put out a number of years ago. You might have a copy in there. If not, I can get you one. But it's basically walking you through the process of determining how much additional N on top of your annual need just to feed the fruit should be applied. So in this case, let's see, this is for avocado. We also have one for citrus. Just for the sake of time, if you look at the bottom of this form here, we base it off of one of two factors. So either a percentage of canopy coverage or approximate tree age. So you'll see that 100% canopied, or in this case, maybe we consider that a fully mature avocado grove, is going to need an additional 30 pounds of nitrogen per season just to maintain its growth. If you combine that with a yield of 10,000 pounds, which is the example given here, and a removal coefficient of 2.5 pounds per thousand. Once you factor for a 70% use efficiency, you're looking at an N rate of 79 pounds of nitrogen for the season. This is the same thing again with citrus, slightly different numbers, but process is still the same. So we'll skip this too, but this is just an example calculation of pounds of nitrogen needed per acre for a 10-year-old avocado orchard. I kind of just did that real quickly. Okay, so a second method would be just using rates that have been determined just through field research. So this could be used potentially in a field or vegetable crop situation where a significant amount of the crop residue might be left in the field after harvest. In this case, so here's an example using strawberries, following the California fertilization guidelines. Total nitrogen recommended for strawberries is going to be 200 pounds of N per acre. And I believe there's additional. So on the FREP website, I know you can find some of these values, and I Andre, that's probably the best resource, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now postseason, this is, let's see, is there an example? No, there's not. So total nitrogen applied, this is going to be box 12B on your worksheet, can be calculated by adding all the inputs that you've recorded throughout the season together. So that's kind of this image here. That would include any nitrogen imported in your irrigation water, any nitrogen from amendments or organic inputs, and then any additional fertilizer that's been applied as well. So you want to account for all of these sources when doing your postseason total nitrogen applied. So nitrogen applied versus nitrogen removed. You calculate your nitrogen removed again based off harvested yield. And then the nitrogen removal coefficient, which generally is going to look something like pounds of N per 1,000 pounds of harvest. And then we'll talk about calculating the ratio between total nitrogen applied and nitrogen removed during harvest. That's your A over R. The A over R values, so this is something that the Water Quality Control Board is interested in, and it's used as a metric to determine the potential for nitrogen loss, essentially. It's not a requirement on the INMP or the INMR. So again, and in the N applied, this is going to be any nitrogen in your irrigation water, organic amendments, fertilizers, or any foliar applied nitrogen. So these are all the sources that have to be considered. Okay, so nitrogen removed, this is your yield. Again, yield times your nitrogen removal coefficient. Again, another QR code there for draft removal coefficients. We'll just skip over this. Okay, so now calculating your A over R. So this is as simple as once you've got your total nitrogen applied, again, the sum of all those sources throughout the season, and you've finalized your yield and you have a nitrogen removed, again, total yield times your removal coefficient. For A over R, that's just those two values applied divided by removed. And then for the A minus R, it's just that applied minus the amount removed. and then to interpret those values. So if your A over R is less than 1, that would indicate that more nitrogen was removed from the field with harvest than was applied. If it's equal to 1, then it's essentially a 1-to-1 removal. So the same amount applied was removed. And then if it's greater than 1, more nitrogen was applied to the field than was removed with harvest. So clearly the goal here is really to get kind of as close to that 1 as possible, but it's most likely you're going to always kind of fall greater than 1, where there's going to be some nitrogen left in the field, but that's okay. See, so this is a strawberry example. So applied 300 pounds of N per acre, yielded 25 tons per acre. The removal coefficient for strawberries is 2.8 pounds of N per ton. So you'd calculate the A over R value. Not going to do the envelope math here, but that's what the equation would look like. And your A over R value is going to be a factor of 4.3. So that kind of gives you an idea. So key points here, again, doing this calculation is not required, but it can be useful in monitoring your N usage, and both of these values will be calculated by VCalc. And again, in order to do these calculations, you're going to need your total N applied, your total yield, and then your nitrogen removal coefficient. Yep, I think that's it. How'd I do? Yep, 15 minutes. That's what I thought. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, so this is my last slide here. I just kind of wanted to highlight the fact that this is a program and requirements that are in development still. So, you know, as this ag order was adopted last year, began working to, you know, meet the requirements to build this program, but it's still in development. So there's still more resources that we'll work with the regional board to put together, develop for growers. A couple of things that we've done recently that are checked off now is, you know, the templates are done. So you have the templates. And as I mentioned, those are, you know, a static form, but it's really about maintaining the information that's called out on that template. So if a more dynamic tracking tool works better for you, fantastic. You definitely can do that. And so we'll develop some of those resources as well to be available. We submitted that draft nitrogen removal coefficient list to the regional board. So I anticipate them approving that pretty quickly. I don't think it's an issue of having any questions with the coefficients themselves. I think it's more of a staffing resource limitation on the regional board's part that's slowing down that approval process. And then most significantly is developing the portal in Clearwater. So that's going to be a really helpful resource where we'll be able to have, you know, all of the tools and tracking forms and templates and reporting portal right there in Clearwater that everybody can access. And then continue doing this training. So we will be doing another full version of the training in probably late January or February. That one will be available in Spanish as well. So we'll have all of the workbook, the handouts translated into Spanish, the presentation translated, and then also have active Spanish translation. So stay tuned early next year for that. When we schedule those dates coming up here, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll advertise that on our email newsletter. And then a couple things that we have that are next steps here. So, you know, continue this training so that we can get as many growers self-certified to do their plans as possible. Continue working with the regional board on any additional guidance that's needed. So, you know, one of the big things that we've been working with them on recently is how to quantify yield for some of those really difficult to quantify yield operations like nurseries or, you know, frequently harvested operations, really small growers, et cetera. So I'll continue to refine that and work with them as we need additional guidance on anything else. So please send me your questions, because the more I can bring very specific questions to the regional board and talk around a specific example, the easier it is to get some guidance. And then most importantly is development of that module in Clearwater. So stay tuned as we develop that, as we have you know, beta tests and grower work groups to help provide comment on that and guidance. We'll let everybody know. So that'll be done later next year, but we'll be working a lot in the meantime to get it there and make it really usable and useful for everybody. So with that, if there are any final questions, happy to take them. Yeah, go ahead. So the question was if hydroponic growers would be subject to this. So if you are subject to the ag order, then you have to do this requirement. So that's really, I guess, the question would be, is your operation subject to the ag order? A couple of questions that would help inform that would be, you know, is it an indoor facility? What's the ground cover like? To see if you would be subject to the ag order. There are some like greenhouse operations that wouldn't be subject to the ag order because they have controlled discharge, but they would be subject to a different type of regulatory permit with the regional board. But I can help answer any questions and evaluate that. We can talk offline. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yep, go ahead. So the deadline coming up this coming March is just to have your plan done, and you're not turning that into VCALG. You're not turning it to anybody. You're just having your plan there on your farm. Technically, if the regional board wanted to do a compliance audit, they could ask you to give it to them, but you're not turning it into anybody. So it's just a deadline to have your plan developed. And again, that's just like the pre-planning component of your plan. That just needs to be developed by March for anything that you plan to plant that year or anything that you have in the ground right then. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Go ahead and wrap up. Have a great day.